Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad Podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nugget on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to another heartfelt episode of I Am Dad Podcast. Today we are joined by a remarkable father, Jason Tuttle, who has turned his deep personal loss into a powerful way to help others. Jason is a former stay-at-home dad and the father of 2 children with multiple physical and cognitive disabilities. Tragically, Jason lost his 15-year-old son, Zachary, in January of 2022. In the midst of his grief, Jason chose to channel his pain into something meaningful by creating Letters to Zachary, a raw and honest exploration of his emotions, shared openly to help others understand the grieving process, especially from a father's perspective. We are honored to have Jason with us today to share his journey, his memories of Zachary, and how he's finding healing through helping others. Please join us today as we welcome this courageous individual, Mr. Jason Tuttle. Get you to the stage here. Good morning, and how you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing wonderful, and thank you for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure. We, I tell people that we started began this podcast, some 3 years ago now. And so we just a couple of weeks ago surpassed our 100th episode. And we also just surpassed 10,000 downloads, and that is also growing really fast as well. I thought it was going to be a fad, Jason. I thought I was going to do it and be like, okay, this was nice for a while, and now let me move on to the next thing. And here I am 3 years later, still doing this. And one of the reasons that I think I continue to do it is because I get to meet people like you. I get to meet real stories in real time, on the ground, really trying to figure this thing out. And I've realized that these stories are healing factors for other dads who think that they're out there alone in these spaces. And so, Jason, we start our podcast off with a very unique icebreaker, and it sets the tone for everyone who is listening, and I think gives perspective, from which you think in this particular space. And that is, tell us your daddy story, and you can frame it however you want, from your own perspective or from your perspective of your dad, however you want it. What is your daddy story?
Well, my personal story with my father is I always had a really good relationship with my father, even though, as I've learned as a married man, if there were arguments or difficulties between my mother and father, I never really heard about them, which I find that to be the sign of a great set of parents, because whatever their disputes were, we weren't in the middle of it per se. And so, we moved around a good bit because my father worked for a company called Scott Paper Company years ago. And so we moved around a good bit with that. But I basically grew up in the state of Alabama for 17 years. All my formative years were there. But as it relates to my father, I mean, he was always there. He was always, willing to help out, very loving. So your typical normal family. My father years ago, my father is of the generation where, they threw house parties, that kind of thing. And so I can remember many a weekend where they'd have guests over and all that. And it eventually evolved into where there was some alcoholism in my family. And I don't say that as a negative per se, because there was never any negativity towards us. I mean, I knew of it, and I knew that at a young age that there might be an issue with it, but I didn't really understand it. And so, my father realized after several years that this was an issue and it needed to be corrected. And he's, as of this year, 30 plus years recovering. He helps out multiple people all the time in just the recovery process from drinking. And it's from a son's perspective and now a father's perspective, it's a great thing to see, just because he may not know it, but it taught me resiliency. It taught me, sometimes we get into these things in life and they may create problems. And what do we do when that creates a problem? Do we try to help correct it, or do we fall victim to it? And my father chose the path of, well, this is an issue. We need to correct this and move on from it. And from that, I guess, trouble, if you will, he went out and helped other people in the midst of his problems. And as I'm trying to do with Letters to Zachary, I've kind of followed in that same footsteps, because as we all know, when it comes down to it, you go back to what you know. And that's what I remember growing up with.
I am a firm believer that God puts nothing on our shoulders that we can't handle. And anything and everything that occurs in our life has a reason and a purpose, whether it is good or bad. And I know that is very hard for people to hear when they're going through the most difficult times of their lives, that for somehow and for some reason that this bad thing that they're going through has a reason or a purpose, but it does. And you may not understand it when it's happening, but as we continue to travel through the process of dealing with it, at some point, a level of understanding does come about. Let's talk about your walk into this journey, particularly being a dad of children with disabilities. I want for you
Okay.
to frame the conversation around Zachary. Help us understand who he was as your child and who he became and how he motivated you into this space.
Okay, so my wife and I, when we got married, I was 26, she was 29. So we were in our late 20s when we got married. And my wife, being from the Northeast and a cradle Catholic, I knew that when we got married, she wanted to have kids, and which is fine. I wanted to have kids as well. But the difference being that her cradle Catholic family, most of her family is one of like 7 or 8. And I'm basically from the South, and we've got a small family. I'm one of 3. And so, we got married. A year after we got married, we decided that we wanted to start having kids. It didn't take us long for her to get pregnant. And, in the beginning, we had no reason to believe that we were going to have any issues whatsoever. Up until that week 20 appointment, which is where you find out the sex of the child, there was no issues. We didn't believe anything other than just everything was going to be kind of status quo, normal, for having a child. Excuse me. And the week 20 appointment came, and during that ultrasound, the tech was looking, and she got to the point of knowing the sex of the child. And she said, well, do you want to know the sex of the child? And my wife and I kind of playfully went back and forth, and she immediately comes back and goes, well, I need to know the sex of the child because I found an issue. And we then said, well, what's the sex of the child? Well, you're having a boy. And we said, can you tell us the issue? And she goes, no, that's more of a doctor related question. And I said, okay, well then why do you need to know if it's a boy or a girl? And she said, well, if it's what I think it is, it's rare in boys and even rarer in girls, the issue that came about. And so from that point forward, we start seeing a perinatologist, which is basically a high-risk OBGYN, up until my son was born. And it was at that point kind of the hammer fell, things start snowballing. I mean, we found out about his rare condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome. Within the next couple of weeks, we found out about his neurological delays, his epilepsy. We started realizing he was going to be nonverbal. He was always going to need a wheelchair. And I mean, it was probably 5 or 6 different things that we found out within that first about 3-month space of time for we just got married. This is our first child. And all of a sudden, what we thought was going to be normal has completely shifted to something that we had no idea was coming. And so my son, right after he was born, at one point we had 6 specialist doctors that we had to see every 6 months, because he had neurological, urological, pulmonary issues, kidney issues, and something else that evades me. But we had a ton of issues that we had to see doctors for. Um, and even with all that being said, and all of the kind of the hurdles that we're now having to go over, my son was always laid back. He was always very happy. Nothing ever really bothered him. He loved people. In fact, he was definitely a ladies' man from the beginning. He loved blonde-haired women. In fact, he had a hierarchy of women. It was blonde, brunette, brown, black, and then redhead in that order. Anytime a blonde-haired woman would come around, he'd open his arms like this to give him a hug, and he'd hug him, and I'd look at his face, and he'd give me this smirk, and I'm just like, buddy, I know what you're doing. And so he was always happy and laid back. And even during, I had to learn several medical procedures at the house. And even when I would have to like give him a catheter, he would lay on the floor with his hands behind his head and just look at me like, let's get this show on the road. And, most adult men, when you tell them we're going to have to give you a catheter, they'd look at you funny and go, why do we need this? But my son didn't know any different, and I mean, he never even flinched when I would do things like that. In fact, there were several times he'd laugh about it, and I'm just like, buddy, I don't know how you're laughing while I'm doing this.
Right.
So even with all of his challenges and things that were coming out throughout the months, nothing really bothered him. And for all of the medical issues he had, it honestly surprised me that he was so laid back.
When you were going through that period in your life, I'm sure that you had some moments where you struggled, either with your
Yes.
mental health or your physical abilities. What kind of things that challenged you that you didn't think you would be able to do that you found out you could?
Well, well, what most people don't realize is there's a period of grieving there. Not in the traditional sense of having lost someone, but more the fact of I lost what I thought was going to be a normal life to this medical life that I had no experience in, that I had to learn all of these medical procedures to do at the house. And so there was, in the beginning there was a lot of anger, and it wasn't necessarily directed at anybody. It was more of an internal anger, just because it was, I'm very talkative, and my son was nonverbal. I taught physical education for 9 years, and my son couldn't play sports. And so there are a lot of like defining father-son activities that just kind of went out the window in the beginning. And I now had to figure out, how do I relate to my son that has all these challenges that can't do the things that I'm most familiar with? And there was a steep learning curve that first 5 or 6 years. Um, you know, Over the years, I've had people tell me, they go, well, you make it look so easy. And I'm upfront with them. I'll go, if you don't think in those beginning years that I wasn't frustrated and I made mistakes and I wanted to go out to the garage and punch a hole through the drywall because I couldn't figure it out. And, I was getting hit from all sides, and, new things were popping up all the time. Don't think it's not all sunshine and rainbows. I said, what you see is all of the years experience I have now to where nothing really bothers me. But in those first several years, it was highly stressful. I got to a point, because I stayed at home with my son and then later my daughter, because I was the physical medical caregiver. I did all the medical procedures, I did all the lifting, I did all of the doctor stays, the hospital stays, all of those things. And doing those things, oh wow, I lost my train of thought. In doing all of those things, there was, it was a lot to take in the beginning. And, for the first at least 6 months to a year, even though they had all these defined issues, I was starting to learn about all the secondary issues that were coming along with the main issues. So I had kind of layers of issues that I was having to deal with and navigate. And then, like I said, once I got about to my 5th or 6th year doing it, nothing really fazed me. I mean, I had times where like my son would be out in public and he'd go into a full blown seizure, and I would just sit there and I just time it looking at him, and people would look at me like I've lost my mind, like, why aren't you doing anything? And I would go, well, per his doctor, I have to wait 5 minutes. And if he doesn't snap out of it in about 5 minutes, then I have to do X, Y, and Z, because he could snap out of it in 5 minutes and it's not necessarily hurting him per se.
Mm-hmm.
And, so learning how to do that, and then just navigating life as a stay-at-home father was certainly a challenge unto itself.
Mm. Which leads me to your relationship, because you were married, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I am married. This will be 21 years.
So, what was the impact on that relationship? Because I'm sure there was a lot of conversations about division of responsibilities, who were going to do what. You both had to be mindful of your feelings,
Mhm,
those dark times you were going through.
mhm.
And I'm sure there were some stresses that were taking place that you didn't think were going to take place. And you had to reevaluate your own relationship and decide at some point, we're going to do this thing together.
Yes, and my wife and I were always kind of proactive when we were dating before we got married. But when we realized we were getting serious, we start talking about these things of, do we want to have kids? Yes, we want to have kids. Initially, my wife wanted four, and my response to her was, "Well, let's have one, and then let's talk." And so we discussed all this, and it was always I was always the one that was going to stay at home. There was no question about that. One, because I'd always been told that I did well with kids. Like I said earlier, I taught PE, but I taught elementary school physical education for 9 years. So I was familiar with the younger age and what their abilities were, and skill sets and all that. So that essentially helped me with some of my son's physical therapy, that kind of stuff. And my wife, she always had kind of the career mindset. And so I said, if you want to go out and have the career and you want me to do the physical, I have no issue with that. And so it was just kind of decided that I was going to be the one to stay at home. And then certainly there were stresses, just because in the beginning you're hit with all these things that you've never heard of. And I'm a researcher, so I had to look up what his rare condition was, what they thought the causes were, what were kind of the secondary issues, plus all of his other issues. So I was constantly researching all this information, trying to learn how to better help my son. As well as, there's a statistic out there that says something to the effect of, a family that's born with one special needs child, the divorce rate is something ridiculously high. It's like
Mhm.
70 something percent.
Mhm.
And later on down the road, 2 years later, our daughter was born who had identical issues as my son.
Mhm.
And so within 3 years, we had two medically fragile children in our house. And so, one day I jokingly looked at my wife and I said, well, if it's 70% for one child, what is it for two?
Right.
And we all my wife and I were of the mindset when we got married, and I told her before I proposed to her, I said, look, I said, I'm only in this to do this once. And I said, I'm of the mindset that, hardships come up, we work them out. I'm not a big proponent of divorce. And so we were kind of that mindset. And when all of this happened, we were just kind of like, well, yeah, this is tough, but what do we do? What are our next steps? How do we take care of our kids? How do we make this as normal as possible, as well as, the relationship between my wife and I. And, I took a lot of burden off her because I did all the physical medical stuff, where she typically dealt with, Georgia Medicaid and insurance stuff, and she has patience for governmental stuff. I do
Mhm.
not, in
Mhm.
any stretch of the imagine. The Our government in the state of Georgia, maybe this country, just drives me up a wall.
That's
And
a
so
whole
I would rather do the, giving catheters and hospital stays and all that
Mhm.
stuff.
That's a whole nother podcast, Jason.
Yeah.
The state of Georgia. We'll have to come back and deal with
Hmm.
that conversation at a separate time. Beyond your wife, what does support look like? Because I'm sure that you struggled with that, and folks looking at you serving as the primary caretaker for a child with disabilities could not have been easy.
It wasn't. In the beginning, when we found out my son, his rare condition is called Eagle-Barrett syndrome, and immediately I got online and searched for it. That was my first thought. I thought, well, I don't know anything about it. Let me see what information I can find, at least to give me some clues or hints to what it is and what I need to do to help better his quality of life. So I did that. And then because we're a social media world, I started looking on social media platforms to see if I could find anybody that had a child with Eagle-Barrett syndrome. Now, I'm old enough to where I was on MySpace many years ago. And so I actually found a family on the West Coast that had a child with Eagle-Barrett syndrome not a month after we had our son. And so that just floored me that I actually found someone. So I got to know them well. And I started building a network through her. And then I found out there was a national organization, and I became a member of that. And within that first year, we went to one of their national conventions. And within the next year, I became vice president of the organization. And so, I'm one of those people that when I know what I want, I move on it. And so I don't sit back. And to this day, that kind of astounds people. They're just like, you just found out your son had a rare condition, and within under 2 years, you were vice president of the national organization. I said, yes, I was. I said, because I just absorbed as much as I could. As for family, we have our family that literally we're in the middle. We've got one set of parents 30 minutes one way. We got one other set of parents 30 minutes the other way. So we had people reasonably close to it. And when my son was first born and my parents were younger, they would actually watch him every Sunday just to give my wife and I kind of a break for a few hours on a Sunday, for us to go out to eat or go to a movie, that kind of thing. So we had that kind of support. And I learned of special needs organizations on the south side of Atlanta that I became a part of that may not have dealt exactly with the rare condition, but they dealt with all of his other conditions, and they at least understood the struggle, even though it wasn't exactly the same as theirs. So there were a lot of different groups of people that we could connect with in the beginning if we had questions, and they could at least guide us in the right direction. Maybe not exactly, but at least the ballpark.
Yeah, I've often said that, support and caretaking is a family affair. People think that it's just a one-off, that one person does it, and it's not easy for one person to do it. You can't, if you don't have help, it's very difficult. But then, Jason, you had a second child. And did you have a moment, when you found out about that child's disability where you say, God, what are we doing here? Like, what is going on?
Well, when my daughter was born, she was for about the first 6 months, she was the normal child. Because we were basing her functioning ability on our son. And we later found out that she was delayed. And I'll be honest, and I own up to it. We had in Georgia years ago, in fact, I think they still do, they had a program called Georgia Babies Can't Wait. And basically it was a program that provided through the state of Georgia kind of free services like PT, OT, speech, and other services where they would come to your house to help out kids with delays and special needs, that kind of thing. And so we had our OT come over to the house, and she had an intern with her. And so one day she says, well, my intern needs to practice what we call the Peabody Skills Assessment Test, which basically defines what their ability at their age and defines whether they're on track for their ability or if they're delayed in their ability for whatever age they are. And I said, sure, she can practice it on our daughter, because my response to her was, sure, you can practice on her. I know what that's going to cost my insurance if I had to pay for it. And I said, y'all want to do it for free, have at it. And so they did. And after about an hour, they came back and said, well, your daughter, in our opinion, is delayed. And at the time I had so much going on. I couldn't process it. And I'll be honest, I reacted the wrong way. I literally looked at both of them, I said, pack up your S and get out of my house.
Mm.
Just like that. And I mean, I later apologized to him. It was more the fact it was just so overwhelming in the time. And, we took our daughter to our pediatrician who has a special needs child. And she goes, I tend to agree with them. You probably want to start seeing neurology and a couple other ones. So we had all that going on at 6 months. And so at 6 months for her, we had to, we started seeing a neurologist, and we were getting CT scans and MRIs. And, at that point, she hadn't shown any signs of seizures or epilepsy. But in hindsight, it was probably another 6 months where she, out of the blue, had her first seizure, which was a grand mal seizure, and that started that ball rolling. So, yeah, it was a lot to handle. It was, both my wife and I were highly stressed, not per se at each other or the kids, just stressed from just the life situation we were in.
Mm. And then you had a third.
No, just the two.
Just the two. Okay. The way I was reading it, I was like, my God. I was like,
No, no,
I'm surprised that this man is getting up in the morning and being able to have a conversation with me.
no,
So,
we two tries, a boy and a girl. In fact, my mother came back after our daughter was born. She said, "You gonna have another one?" I went, "Have you lost your mind?" I'm just like, "No,
that's
with
why when
two
I saw
tries,
it,
a boy and a girl."
yeah, I don't know what I was reading, but I was like, wait a minute, is this thing saying? I had to go back and read whatever I was reading, but somehow I calculated three. But now, in the
No.
midst of that, you lost Zachary.
Yes.
And so how did that impact your life?
Oh wow, it was earth shattering. Because I was a stay-at-home parent, I was his 24/7, 365 care. Literally, my whole life revolved around everything I did for him. I was I was on in what I would call go mode all the time. In fact, I still have sleeping issues from all of those years. I just don't sleep.
Mm,
And so basically, what had happened was about 3 days before everything happened, he caught what we thought was a 24-hour virus. It slowly progressed in symptoms that I had never seen before throughout the next about 36 hours. And the day that everything happened, I got him up at 8:30 that morning. By 9:30, he was at the hospital, and by 10:34, he was pronounced. It was that fast.
wow.
Um, Apparently, he had gotten an infection somewhere in his system. It turned into sepsis. It got into his bloodstream, and statistically speaking, once sepsis get in your bloodstream, the mortality rate is something like, it's like 95+%. It's ridiculously high. So it was devastating. As a parent of a child with a chronic illness, you always kind of have it in the back of your mind that it's a possibility,
Hmm.
but you never think it's going to happen versus a child that's got, say, a terminal illness.
Hmm.
And it was more the fact that it was so fast and so sudden that it shattered us. I was actually up in the ER trauma room as they were working on. I saw everything they did from the moment he came in there to the moment he was pronounced.
Hmm.
So, later on down the road, I realized I probably had a good bit of PTSD from just watching all of that,
Hmm.
which I finally accepted probably 6 months after the fact.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it shook our whole family. It was just, in fact, when right after everything had happened, I called his mother, and I'll never forget the sound she made because she was working at home.
Hmm.
Just the sheer, just guttural,
Right.
desperation that she made. And then I had to call my mother, who they had watched him for years. And I remember, her response. And uh, um, my mother came back and said, well, you were unusually calm, cool, and collected when you called. And it was literally like 5 minutes after they had pronounced him.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, everything had happened, and we came home, and it was when we finally got home and we got into the quiet house, and the old saying, the silence is deafening.
Mm-hmm.
um, the silence, I'm in his room right now. um, I came into his room and the silence just hit me and I just buckled. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, just the weight of the world just hit me. And from that point forward, it was multiple times a day, every day, at least for the first 9 months, if not year. A- After the first year, it started getting where there's a little more space in between the episodes, but they were still pretty frequent.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was one of those things where we go, when the services were done and the funeral fanfare was over, my wife and I just kind of looked at it and said, what do we do now?
Mm-hmm.
And we were lost and numb. And all of your typical grief signs: didn't want to deal with people, didn't really want to go out anywhere, just didn't want to deal with just life for at least 6 months afterwards.
Wow. And that was in 2022. So that was during somewhat the pandemic, right? So did you kind of think it was COVID related?
No. For the longest time, well, 4 months prior, my son had a major surgery, a spinal fusion surgery, because he had scoliosis. And one of the things that they required before he went into surgery was the COVID shot. You know, I'm not one of those anti-vax people. If you want to take it, great. If you don't, that's your choice. I don't chastise anybody for their decision.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have him get it for the longest time, just because he had so many other issues and was respiratory illnesses he was very susceptible to.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I didn't know what that shot was going to do to him because he was medically compromised.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the longest time, I didn't want him to have it, because I was just like, well, you hear these stories in the news of people that are perfectly healthy, they take this shot, and then, you know, all hell breaks loose, kind of thing. And I was just like, if I were to have given him that shot and it would have injured or he'd have died from it, I would have never been, I would have never been able to live with myself.
Mm-hmm.
So for several months before that, I kept calling his pulmonologist and I said, I want to know what your professional opinion is. And multiple times they would call me back and they would kind of toe the company line of what the hospital wanted them to say. And so I finally called up, spoke to the doctor personally and said, look, you know me well. I'm very proactive. I've always been very upfront with you. I want to know your professional opinion. If you're pro shot, great. If you're anti shot, fine. I said, that doesn't mean I'm going to make any decision other one way or another. I just want to know what you're professional. And so I finally pulled it out of her. And
Mm-hmm.
after she told me, I said, you know what? I think I'm going to get it for him because he's about to go into a surgery and I don't want any more complications to happen. So he had that, no real complications from it. Now, the spinal fusion surgery, that was a long process to get through and healing process. And, after he had healed from that, let's see, that was July of that year. He was fine. He was essentially healed by the time school got back in. So, I mean, he was perfectly healthy up until that moment that he got sick in January. So we really had no idea that anything like that was coming.
Mm-hmm. So out of that tragedy in your life, in your wife's life,
Hmm.
Letters to Zachary was created.
Yes.
Was that
Yes.
as a result of the grief or part of the grief process or both?
Kind of all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is I'm a big proponent of therapy and counseling. Honestly, literally about 2 weeks before everything happened, I felt like I'd kind of run through a season of therapy. And I contacted my counselor and said, hey, I don't think I have enough to come for a whole full hour anymore. I'm just like, I think I'm going to stop coming. If something should come up, I'll call you. I'll start seeing you again. Great, wonderful. Everything happened, and I immediately called her up and I said, I need an emergency session if you've got time. I said, I will explain when I get there. And so she was able to fit me in, and I told her, and like everybody, I'm sorry for your loss, that kind of thing. And so I started seeing her every week at that point. And probably about the fifth or sixth time afterwards that I saw her, she goes, have you ever thought about journaling? And I said, I don't know if journaling's my thing. I don't really know how great of a writer I am. I said, I just don't know if that's something I want to do. And so she goes, well, you don't necessarily have to do it, but put it on the back burner. You can go back to it at any point in time. She said, the great thing about journaling is, she said, you can either keep it personal or share it. You can print it out and burn it, or you can, delete it off your computer, whatever. She says, more just to get it out so it's not sitting on top of you. I said, okay. And so that idea sat on my side table probably for 9 months after the fact. I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to, at least in the beginning, I didn't want to have to grieve, even though I knew I had to. And so one day I was on social media, I was watching like a Facebook reel, and something came on. I don't remember what it was, but something reminded me of my son. And man, it hit me like a Mack truck. Like I just started just bawling because it reminded me something of my son. And at that point, I opened up a Word document, and in proper, Oxford English style, I addressed a letter to my son, and I just kind of verbally vomited on the page is what happened. And I mean, it was raw. It was, if I felt like it needed to be expletive laden, that's how I wrote it, because that's how I was feeling in the moment. And I did that multiple times a day, every day for weeks, just to get it out. And kind of the evolution of it is, I got into a Facebook group, and I got to know the admin real well. And, a lot of these grief groups are majority women. And so one day I said, do you mind if I post a journal entry? And she said, no, we'd love for you to. We so rarely get men in here willing to open up. So I posted, and right before I hit send, I go, no, I have to mentally prepare myself. Even though this is a noble thing I'm writing about, I can get positive or negative comments, because it is the internet. And so am I mentally able to handle the negativity should I get it? And so I just kind of went, you know what? It doesn't matter. It needs to be said. And so I submitted it. Well, no more than I submitted it, I got a massively positive response in this group. I had multiple, mothers, daughters, girlfriends, you name it, come out and say, we've never met. I've never told anybody my deepest, darkest feelings as it relates to the loss of my child. And you have hit the nail on the head. You have said word for word how I feel. And, and I came back and I said, well, I appreciate it. I said, it's inspired by my son, and I'm glad it resonates with you. I said, but this is kind of my son coming through me. So after that point, every so often I'd keep posting letter. I'd keep getting these just massive responses. And after about the fourth or fifth one, in my brain, I went, maybe I have something here. I need to grow this. And so what then happened next was it evolved into, the suggestions were, have you ever thought about writing a book? Well, at the time I didn't have enough material, and I was just like, I don't have enough material at this point. Have you thought about doing a podcast? I don't know if I'm in the brain space for that right now. And several ideas came out. And so finally the last idea was literally, well, if you thought about making a page on Facebook, you could list it as a blogger, and all you'd have to do is copy and paste, and you're not creating more material, you're just kind of moving it. And I went, I could do that. And so I started doing that. And after about a month of doing it and having like 10 or 20 followers, I went, you know what, I'm going to start reaching out to some of the big names in the grief community and just see if I can get pointers. And so I did. I reached out to multiple people that had, 10,000 plus followers, that kind of thing. And I said, hey, my name is so-and-so. I've got this page. Can you give me ideas of things that work for you, that, you grew your page? Can you give me ideas of things that maybe didn't work so well, just to give me a ballpark of how I can grow this. And all of them were great. They all gave me ideas. I implemented most of those ideas on my page. And from that point, it started taking off.
Mm-hmm.
I was getting, 30 and 40 followers a day, that kind of thing. I mean, it was almost instant. I was kind of stunned that I was getting that many followers. And, I just kept growing it and growing it. And as of today, I've been doing this 10 months. I've got over right at 1,100 followers. I
Mm.
mean, if you'd have told me 10 months ago I'd have 1,100 followers and be doing your podcast and the other, I'd have looked at you and said, "You're crazy. You lost your mind."
Hmm. Yeah, but you have a
And so,
story to tell, and your story is needed. I can't even listen. I've been in this work specific to fatherhood 20 years now. Not for
mhm,
profit work 30 years.
yeah,
And what I've learned, Jason, over that time is stories are critically important
mhm,
to healing,
mhm,
and that the stories of men are
mhm,
critically necessary right now.
mhm,
Because one of the questions I was going to follow up and ask you was, have you found your tribe yet? And what I mean by that is, social media is good,
mhm,
and you can find a community, that supports who you are and what you do.
mhm.
But I think that every man needs their tribe, and that's those
Yep.
personal people, those 4 or 5 people. I saw a meme the other day that said, "Be mindful of the people who reach out to you when you're silent." And I just
Mhm.
was like listening to that, and I was like, man, what does that mean? I was like, oh, like when you are not who you are, people
Yep.
who are most connected to you will know that without you saying that. Have you
Yeah.
found your tribe yet?
Certainly. I have gotten to know many people in the grief community, several of which I have collaborated media things and content online. Um, I have had a multitude of people help me out getting the page started and helping promote it for me. And I mean, I, as well as help promote them on multiple different occasions for different things that they've done. And so, yeah, there's a group of probably 4 or 5 people, maybe more, that I converse with pretty frequently in this whole grief journey, just because like what you're doing and several of us in the grief community, we all have stories that we want to be told, to share to others. um, you know they like one of the first podcast I was ever on, she gave me a shot not knowing who I was just some random new guy doing grief stuff. And she liked the story so much that she was just like, you know what, I've got, like, on her personal page, she had like 4,000 connections, and she
Mhm.
literally invited all 4,000 connections to my page and what I was doing. And then, like, she moderated groups and promoted in there. And so it was things like that that were just kind of mind blowing. Is that was how our connection started. I
Mhm.
mean, she didn't know me from Adam. She didn't know if I was just some fly by night person that I may end up stop 2 months from now.
Mhm.
But she invested in me, and it was that from her that helped me to grow, which to this day I'm forever grateful for, because it's made to where I am today.
Mhm.
Um, there's a gentleman on TikTok that's got 250,000 followers on there that does grief, that I've connected with, and you know, um, who's out on the West Coast, that we've collaborated and done YouTube stuff and TikTok stuff. And so yeah, I do feel like I've got the grief tribe that that we're all a part of. Um, and I made that probably the first 2 months I was doing all of this. It was
Mm.
very early on.
Mm. Well, add me to that tribe because I really want to
Sure.
figure out how to continue to elevate this conversation. There's some folks out there that I definitely want to introduce you to, on the
Sure.
national, level and even international level. I think this is an important conversation to have, particularly as we
Mm,
elevate this notion of men as caretakers, however
mhm,
that looks, for men,
mhm,
whether it's caretaking for their children, caretaking
mhm,
for children with special needs, or for their elderly parents, or whatever the case may
mhm,
be. This story for me, Jason, does
mhm,
something that I continue to say, and I say it over and over and over again, because I
mhm,
believe it's the key to getting society to really embrace and have a level of empathy for men. And that is, at
mhm.
some point, we have to figure out how to humanize fatherhood. We have to figure out
Exactly.
how to humanize it. And I think that because people look at us and look at fathers as this kind of thing that is either needed or not needed,
Mhm.
there's no embracement of connectivity or transparency that people feel connected to. And so that's why telling our stories is so important, because that is
Sure.
what humanizes the issue. Right. And so
Mhm.
in this conversation, I think that this could do a great deal in doing that. When you
Sure.
think about Zachary, how did that change your focus on your daughter? Did it increase and intensify that focus?
Um, for a brief period after my son had passed away, and all the services had gone by, that kind of thing. My wife and I literally looked at us and go, and we almost said in unison, we go, we're not sure. We've always been involved in our daughter's life, but my son was definitely the more medically fragile of two. He
Hmm.
definitely needed more of the constant care than my daughter did. And when all the dust settled from the funeral, that kind of thing, we literally looked at us and said, do we even really know our daughter?
Mm.
We were present, and she was always doing everything we were doing, and we always included her, that kind of thing. It's not that, it's more, we were so focused on my son that sometimes, unfortunately, she kind of got lost in the shuffle at times, especially during those times I'd have to take him to the hospital, and I'd be in the hospital 7 to 10 days with my son. And we looked at each other and went, do we know her likes and dislikes, and just your typical things. So for a brief period, we had to kind of relearn our daughter.
Mm.
And definitely, the intensity has gone her way. One, because now she's my only living child, and so I can definitely put the radar solely focused on her, and trying to help her with with school stuff and just life stuff and just family stuff.
Hmm.
um, so for a while there was kind of almost a relearning of our daughter, just because we realized after our son had passed away that our focus was just so divided, and it wasn't on purpose, it was just the necessity of what was going on.
Right.
So, and I mean, we have certainly reconnected with our daughter and relearned, and things are kind of the way they were in the beginning before everything kind of blew up.
How's she doing now?
She's doing well. My daughter, like my son, has developmental delays. So even though she's 15 years old, she functions about 4 to 6.
Mm.
And, she's as teenagery as possible at this point. She is, and in my house, when she starts getting an attitude, we call it being ornery.
Hmm.
She's ornery as ever. But I mean, she's also she's genuinely pretty happy. She likes being around people. She likes being the center of attention. So overall, she's doing well. And even right after everything had happened, I had to figure out a way to, for lack of better words, dumb down the concept of grief and death well enough to try to get her to kind of grasp the concept.
Mm.
And for a while there, we think she might have got it. We're not 100% sure. There were moments where she would just out of the blue just have meltdowns, which we assumed were grief, because
Mm.
she was missing her brother.
Hmm.
Um, And for the longest time, I 100% believe that she blamed me for it. And the reason why I say that was because she always knew when her brother was sick, I took him to the hospital. I was there when he got admitted. I stayed the whole time and I brought him home. And I always came home with him. Well, the day that everything happened, she was at school. She got home from school in the house, and I was home. Her mother was home, and our son was not home. And she immediately, you could see her body language change because she called her brother Bubba because that was the name that came out. And she looked at me like, well, where's Bubba? And at that point I had to go, how am I going to explain this? And so I kind of got down on one knee, kind of eye level, and said, girl, Bubba's not with us anymore. I said, he's in heaven now. And I said, if I could have brought him home or saved him, believe me, Daddy would have. I would have in a heartbeat, but I didn't, I didn't have a say in it. And so I just keep kind of reiterating those kind of simple points to her. And I mean, I think she gets it, but I can't 100% say I think she's okay with it at this point because we're 2.5 years removed from it. And like my son was cremated, so the urn he's in is kind of like the head. It looks like the top head part of a grandfather clock with the clock in it. It's kind of a box right there. And so whenever she starts getting to where I think she's sad about it, I look at her and go, girl, I know you don't understand this, but your brother is literally sitting right next to you. Right. And so that seems to calm her down because at this point I've said it enough.
Jason, what's the messaging? What do you want other fathers to know who are in similar situations and may be struggling? What is it that you can say to them to help them somewhat through their process?
Well, as a man myself, I know that a lot of men won't do anything until they see someone else do it. They want to see an example of someone doing it. Whether they're doing it well or doing it poorly, they just want to see someone else doing it. So I would tell men out there, if you're looking for someone that's doing it, you're looking no further. I said, I'm choosing to be vulnerable to an internet that could at any point either be with me or against me. And I mean, I'm okay with that, but it needs to be said. I've said multiple times in this journey that the world needs to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of grief, whether from a female or male perspective. And it's okay to be vulnerable. And, I try to tell other men, am I asking you to come cry on my shoulder? No, that's not necessarily what I'm asking. If that's what the moment brings, I'm okay with it. But that's not what I'm saying is I'm trying to create an environment to where you can feel like you can open up and not have to worry about it being used against you, thrown back in your face, one of the things I try to tell women as it relates to men, you have to stop listening to respond and listen to listen. I said, because yes, men are simplistic creatures, but men know the difference. We know when you're listening just to find a point that you can respond to, and then you jump on that point. I try to let men know the other part of Letters to Zachary is the fact that I'm trying to help women understand what they're doing right and things I think they need to tweak. And, I tell women as it relates to men all the time, men are about security. They want to feel safe and especially in emotional environments, and they want respect. Those are the two big ones. And I said, if you're coming at them with this, you did this, and throwing things back in their face, I said, men are kind of like the baseball analogy. It's going to be 3 strikes and you're out. They'll give you a couple of chances. And I said, once you get beyond that threshold, a lot of men are just going to close up and they're done with it. So you have to create an environment where they feel safe enough to open up. And one way of doing that is allowing them to open up and not minimizing what they're talking about. If a man's willing to open up to you about something emotional, no matter how minimal you think it is important to him. If you trash that idea, that is a strike against you. Okay. And so there's several other points, but those are the big ones I try to tell to women, and I try to let men know this is what I'm trying to tell to the female gender. These are the things that would work with me. Hopefully they will work with you. And, I get it. We all get to, as married couples, we have our arguments. And, sometimes I've brought things up. Sometimes my wife has brought things up. But we can't constantly do that. Otherwise, it will eventually get where we won't talk to each other.
Right. Call to action. Jason, how can people get in touch with you? How can they help support your work? What would you like folks to do?
Okay. If you are on Facebook, I have Letters to Zachary on Facebook. I have Letters to Zachary on TikTok, as well as Instagram. My two main ones are Facebook and TikTok, and then I kind of transfer my content over to the others. And Facebook is more or less, written letter form, written prose, memes. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll take other people's content, give them the credit for it, and then I'll kind of like quote it and give the male perspective of it, is what I'll do on there. TikTok, as everybody knows, is video form. Typically, I'll get on there if I have random like grief questions, and I'll make, usually it's a 5-minute video. Lately, it's been kind of 3 minutes or less. It's just short form videos. Just like I got on there yesterday and said, the typical consensus online is the second year in grief is worse than the first year. What year has been the worst year for you? Please let me know in the comments. And I mean, I've so far gotten 10 or 20 comments on it about what people think. So that's kind of the stuff I do on TikTok. I just got my professional website live, and that's www.letterstozachary.com. That has information about the Facebook page, the Facebook group, all of my social media. It's got videos of my son on there, pictures. It's got information on me, what Letters to Zachary's doing. It's got multiple like media appearances on there. People want to hear other appearances, that kind of thing. And then the last thing, which I'm trying to get into, is I'd like to get into public speaking. And so I've got a portion on there that says who I am, what my signature topics are, what I can talk about, that kind of thing on there, that's on there. And the last thing is I just released a grief coloring book. It released last Friday. That's on Amazon. It's a tool to help parents talk with their children about the difficult topics of grief, death, and trauma while doing a de-stressing mindfulness activity of coloring. So that is on my page. It's like the third section down, and if you hit the button, it'll take you exactly where you can purchase it if someone's interested.
Jason, thank you so much for being a guest, and thank you for showing up the way you are in this world. I think people will benefit from your story. I don't think you've even touched the surface of the lives you're going to impact moving forward. I think that your ministry, that your work, your calling, your passion is going to impact a lot of people, and therefore impact a lot of children, therefore impact a lot of families. I really, really, truly believe that, and I will find ways to connect you into the work that we're doing to elevate your voice within that space as well. So I appreciate you. And as my bishop always says to me, I love you, and there's absolutely nothing you could do about it. And so let's continue to do this work together. And to my I Am Dad podcast listeners, thank you so much for joining us. This is Jason Tuttle. Make sure you visit him. Google him, as the young folks would say, Letters to Zachary. I'm sure you'll find his Facebook, TikTok, and all other platforms that he is engaged in. And you know how I like to leave you. Always be kind to others as you're kind to yourself, or you might find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And as my good friend Art Mitchell and mentor used to always say to me, it's nice to be important, but you know what? It's much more important to be nice. Until next Sunday, God bless.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting IamDadPodcast.com. That's IamDadPodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am Dad, period.